Everyone should be keeping Damar Hamlin and his family in their thoughts. We truly do hope for the best for them. We also need to acknowledge, though, that Damar Hamlin and his amazing team of nurses and doctors would never have had the chance to do what they're doing now, which is absolutely crucial to Damar's life, if it wasn't for the professionalism of the Buffalo Bills trainer and the EMS on scene, who acted under pressure that almost no other medical professional could ever possibly comprehend. So we have to talk about Damar Hamlin because, well, it's what we do and you guys have asked us for it. So we had to rush this video out in time, so I apologize if it's not up to our usual standard of quality, but yeah. For those that need a quick update on Damar Hamlin, he is still intubated, but has been able to communicate by writing, and he has asked who won the game. I'll explain what intubation means in a bit, because I want to make something clear. This video is not just for EMS responders. There's something we have to talk about that applies to everybody. Everyone who saw that game, everyone who will ever need to call 911, pretty much everybody. That said, let's get on with it. So Damar Hamlin, a safety for the Buffalo Bills, tackled a receiver, T. Higgins, who plays for the Bengals, during a game on Monday night. Shortly after that, Damar stood up, was uneasy on his feet, and then fell down. This all happened within seconds of Damar tackling T. Higgins, and during that process, he took a hit directly to the center of his chest from T. Higgins. After he collapsed, CPR was administered for 10 minutes or maybe more, according to one of the announcers, and then he was transported to a local hospital where his care continues. His heart did stop on the field, and it was restarted on the field as well, and this has left a lot of people asking, what happened? It's also left a lot of people trying to tell you what happened, and in response to that, it's left a lot of other people telling you that those people don't know what they're talking about and that that's definitely not what happened, and so we don't know. Here's the definitive answer. We may never know. Short of his physicians finding a definitive sign of something congenital or something pre-existing and not knowing what Damar felt prior to the event happening, we have no idea what could have possibly occurred. The running theory that everyone keeps hearing is something called commotio cordis. Now, I'm sure everyone's been YouTubing what commotio cordis is, but if you haven't, I'll explain. Or if someone else explained it and you didn't quite get it, here's my best attempt. Now, keep in mind, this explanation is for every person out there who wants to know what commotio cordis possibly is. So some brief cardiac anatomy. So commotio cordis is a phenomenon that impacts your heart. Your heart is built like this. You have two top chambers called the atria and two bottom chambers called the ventricles. Now, all these chambers are important, but the ventricles are arguably more important. So your heart works with electricity. And that's not some kind of metaphor. It's literally electricity. It literally has biological wiring in it to help it keep pace. And the way it works is there's an electrical stimulus at the top that squeezes the top and then squeezes the bottom. And it goes lub, dub, all day long. Now, the heart's made up of cells, and each and every one of these cells has the ability to contract, and it's important that they do so in a uniform manner to make a squeeze. Think about the wave that people used to do in NFL stadiums. It's a lot like that. The electrical stimulus passes through the ventricles and just causes a cascade of a squeeze, and it's this perfect squeeze. One of the ventricles squeezes blood up to the lungs, and the other squeezes blood out to the rest of the body, and that's how blood gets to your brain and your kidneys and all the things you need to function. Now, a little bit more on how those cells contract. It's a combination of electricity and chemistry, and no, I'm not going to get into it too much, but this is what I am going to tell you, is that those cells, when they receive an electrical stimulus, or if they receive a physical stimulus, what will happen is there's sodium and potassium that's both outside and inside the cells, and they'll switch places, and that essentially cascades into the contraction. Now, if the sodium and potassium are not in the right place, it's physically impossible for that cell to contract. It just can't. So now go back to that image of the wave. Now, during the wave, you'll notice that some people have their hands up, some people have their hands down. And the people who have their hands up, let's just say they're not ready to start another wave because their hands are still up. The only people that could possibly start another wave are people who have their hands down. Think of those as the cells that are ready to receive another stimulus. So earlier you might have remembered I mentioned that a physical force, which actually causes the cell to stretch, can cause a contraction as well. It can cause the sodium and potassium to swap places. Now remember, I said it's important that these cells all squeeze together in a wave, in a coordinated fashion. Well, imagine if all of a sudden there was a stimulus on all those cells, but only some of them could start and the others couldn't. Well, it wouldn't be coordinated, right? Part of the heart would contract, the other part wouldn't, and you'd get what we call fibrillation, with all the cells being completely off kilter. When the ventricles fibrillate, they don't do their job. Blood doesn't go to the lungs, and blood doesn't go out to the rest of the body, and this is one form of cardiac arrest, because even though the heart is moving, it's not doing anything. Blood's not coming out of it, and that's its one job, is to get blood out of it into the rest of the body. So one of the running theories is that when Damar Hamlin received a strike right into the middle of his chest, it just so happened to hit at the right time where part of his cells could contract and the other part couldn't. And by the time he stood up, he was out of blood pressure, which that's what you need to perfuse your brain, and he fell to the ground. Now, a lot of people have tried to say that that's not it, and they brought up things like this doesn't follow the pattern that we know about commotio cordis. Here's the problem with that. We don't know what the pattern of commotio cordis really is. The data is actually super sparse. In fact, commotio cordis is more often diagnosed when everything else is ruled out because short of having this happen while you're wearing a cardiac monitor, there's no way to know exactly what went on in your heart at the time you received a hit. Now, some people are saying that this typically happens in males that are 20 or younger, and Damar Hamlin was 24, so he was kind of out of the range. That statistic, though, may be skewed because we see this actually more commonly in Little League Baseball with younger players that may not have experience enough to appropriately block a ball to the chest. That's when we see it most. So it could just be that the age group is just entirely skewed in one direction. The other thing that we don't know about commotio cordis is that we don't know exactly how it works. The explanation I gave earlier is actually just what we presume, because again, it's not like people are getting hit in the chest while wearing a cardiac monitor out on the field. They're not. So we don't actually know. So when people are saying they don't think that's the case, they're really going based off of what we know, and what we know actually isn't much. Now, it could be entirely possible that he has congenital defects. That he has other congenital defects that may have contributed to this. He may have actually been feeling sick for the entire game, which would actually lead us to think that maybe it's not CC. Maybe it's something completely different. And there really isn't enough evidence at this point to lean for or against any particular mechanism for this. We just simply don't know. Now, what happened after Damar collapsed? Now, players and staff alike all crowded around Damar and tried to help him. There was a lot of confusion. And at first, people did not seem aware that his heart had stopped. But then a trainer named Denny Kellington recognized that he was in cardiac arrest and started CPR. After that happened, that clued everyone in that his heart had stopped, and he was able to get an AED brought to him, and he was defibrillated in the field. Now, defibrillation is the resolution for CC, or basically anything that would cause you to go into ventricular fibrillation. One point I want to make clear is there's a lot of ways to get to ventricular fibrillation, not just CC. Now, for those of you that are not in the medical field and you keep hearing me say the word fibrillation, it probably sounds familiar to a word that you have definitely heard before, and that is defibrillation. Well, that is where the defibrillator gets its name. See, defibrillators don't work well on flatline cardiac arrest. Defibrillators work great on fibrillation arrest, which is what a CC will do. So he was defibrillated on the field. Now, I don't know how many times he was defibrillated, but that is a resolution to what he has that's going on, and it is almost definitely one of the key components that saved his life, along with early CPR. Because what defibrillation does is, think about those people doing the wave again. Defibrillation basically applies a huge electrical stimulus, just massive, and makes all those people sit down so they can receive the next wave in coordination. That's what defibrillation does, and it works really freaking well. Shortly after that, he was transferred to a local hospital where, as I mentioned earlier, he's still receiving care. Now, I want to address a couple of other things that people have come up and said. Now, I've also read that some people doubt that the strike that Damar received to his chest would not be enough to cause commotio cordis. I'm going to call shock on that. When it comes to commotio cordis, it's more about timing and less about actual force. And also, I want to point out that even if it was about force, he was hit really hard, at least when compared to things that we actually know will, for a fact, cause a ventricular response. For example, one treatment we have in the field, though it's not used very often, is something we call a precordial thump. Now, a precordial thump is basically punching someone in the chest to apply the stimulus. When they go into a dangerous rhythm, what we're doing is we are taking the ulnar side of our fist and thumping on the bottom half of the sternum. Now, we don't do this very commonly. In fact, we only typically do this when we witness somebody go into this rhythm and the defibrillator is charging. And then we'll do it right away as the defibrillator charges to see if we can get it to stop immediately. But it's certainly not as good as a defibrillator. You do this strike from about 20 centimeters above the patient's chest, or about the height of about 3 of your fists. Now, Here's what I'm going to say. If I can cause a change in a ventricular rhythm by punching someone from 20 centimeters away with the soft part of my fist, I'm decently certain that 218-pound professional athlete T. Higgins could also potentially cause ventricular change when he hits somebody with his shoulder square in the chest. We don't know, but the force was certainly present to cause this. So let's talk a little bit about how Damar Hamlin seems to be doing now. Damar Hamlin is currently in the ICU or intensive care unit, which is exactly where someone who is a post-arrest patient would be, and will probably be there for a bit longer regardless of how he improves. There's several things that are going on right now. The good news is that he appears to be neurologically intact according to his physicians. He's having conversations though through writing, and there's still more tests to be done, but these are all good signs. Good signs that, by the way, are only possible not just because of what the Bills trainer did, but because of the EMS response by local providers on scene. And I'm going to talk more about that later because that is crucial in what we take away from this event. Now, you might have also read that Damar Hamlin is currently on a ventilator and they're trying to get him to breathe on his own, and that may cause some concern, and well, it should cause some concern. But there's also one caveat in that this is actually not terribly unheard of, especially in patients who suffered cardiac arrest. Often patients are intubated in the field. That's the process where a tube is placed in your trachea. In the field, they will be bagged with a bag valve mask, the thing that you squeeze. If you've taken a CPR class, you've definitely learned about those. Now, I'm not certain if he was intubated in the field or if another kind of airway was used. I just don't know. If you guys do, please comment below. Once someone's been intubated and then ventilated, we don't want to take them off of ventilatory support right away. In fact, we will keep these patients sedated and in a medically induced coma as we figure out exactly what is going on with the patient. What we don't want to do is have them go back into a cardiac arrest or cause respiratory failure by taking their respiratory support away until we know that they can do it on their own. But there's something else that we should know. Now, your lungs, the way they operate, the best way to think about your lungs and the way they open and fill with air is think of a door that's covered in bubble wrap on one side and just has a normal doorknob on the other. If you don't want to pop the bubble wrap, which is kind of like the alveoli inside your lungs, which are little sacs of air that your lungs are comprised of, then it's probably better that you pull the door open. And that's how your body naturally works. It pulls open the chest cavity and air comes in. Well, when we use a bag valve mask in the field, or when we're using ventilators in the hospital or on like a critical care unit or even some ground ambulances, we're actually doing things a little backwards. We're pushing on the bubble wrap side. And if we're not careful, and sometimes even when we are, we can actually cause some damage that way. And suddenly pulling that ventilatory support away from a body that's been used to this assistance can actually cause someone to have respiratory failure and get worse. So people are often weaned off of vents over time, a little bit each time until their body is able to breathe on its own. We call that ventilation weaning. While I have no way of knowing the extent of any lung damage that Damar may or may not have, the process of being weaned off a vent alone is not necessarily cause for concern by itself. Now, if there is only one thing that we all need to hope for out of this event, it's simply that Damar is able to return to the NFL and that his family and his friends and his fellow players don't have to experience the loss of someone they knew and loved. You see, for the first time in a while, EMS and first responders, and I'm including Denny Kellington in that, the trainer who applied CPR, and I actually gotta say, I'm kind of proud of the media in this case for actually defending EMS in this. See, initially, there were critiques as to why did they stay on the field for 10 plus minutes? Why didn't they just transport him to the hospital? But the media actually did a very good job, although not as detailed as I'm about to be, at saying that no, actually, they should try and get the heartbeat back in the field. And they were absolutely right. Most of the media stories I read portrayed us correctly and defended EMS. Because here's what's really important to know. What happened with Damar Hamlin isn't unique. The only thing that's unique is how we got to see it. But today around the world, 1,000 times over, EMS and first responders are going to save many other people's Damar Hamlins. They're going to save other people's brothers, their fathers, their daughters, their sons. And they're going to do exactly what you saw there. They're going to get on scene. They're going to give CPR. They're going to defibrillate. They're going to start IVs. They're going to give medications. They're going to intubate. They're going to do everything that the emergency room will do before they're able to fix anything. And it's for that reason that EMS will stay on scene until they get a pulse back. Don't get me wrong, we used to load and go, and by and large, that's what the public still believes we should do, is get into the hospital as quick as we can, because that's the only way they can be saved. But that's simply not true. We got plenty of people to the hospital with a pulse that never left the hospital. Why? Because instead of focusing on getting the heart rhythm back in the field, we would just load and go, and no one would be doing chest compressions or defibrillation during that time. And it's that downtime when blood is not getting to the brain that causes the brain to die. You see, when someone's heart stops, we tell you to do CPR because you're literally squeezing the heart and pushing blood from the heart up to the brain. And you try and keep that going for as long as you can with as minimal interruptions as you can. And if you have not taken a CPR class, by the way, go take a CPR class. You could save somebody's life. But as good as CPR is at being a holding pattern, it pales in comparison to what the heart can do. The heart does a much better job at circulating blood than us trying to push from the outside, and that's why it's so crucial that we get the heart started in time. EMS agencies across the world have seen patients walk out of hospitals at rates that they never did before when we used to load and go. We have shown that by having paramedics stay on scene and work the code, as we call it, we have shown that patients are spending less time in the ICU and they are able to return back to their neurological baseline at a much higher rate. So if EMS ever comes to your house and they take 10 minutes or even more, good. They're doing the right thing. Now, there's one other thing that I really want to point out. I want to give a shout out to the EMS crew that was on scene. The amount of energy that had to be taking place in that stadium, the amount of pressure to load and go, which every paramedic watching this has probably received that pressure from a family at some point in time. Imagine the pressure that they faced in the middle of an NFL game, a nationally televised NFL game, running a code on a player. They didn't panic. They did not load and go. Instead, they set the example. And because of that, they saved somebody's life. The honest truth is this: they could have done a load and go, and nobody would have ever questioned it. Nobody would have called them out to the carpet publicly. Nobody would have said a thing because the public would have felt that was the right thing because it looks like the right thing, but they didn't. They stayed professionals. And so to that EMS crew, thank you. You represented EMS accurately. And because you did it the way that you did it, hopefully you have given the public a more accurate view of what paramedics and EMTs are doing each and every day. Anyway, guys, that is it for the video. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Pulled it out really quick. I hope it was all right. If you know anybody that you think could learn from this, and that includes other responders, family members, or people that are not even in the medical profession whatsoever, please send them this video. There's a lot that people need to know. Everyone should be keeping Damar Hamlin and his family in their thoughts. We truly do hope for the best for them. We also need to acknowledge, though, that Damar Hamlin and his amazing team of nurses and doctors would never have had the chance to do what they're doing now, which is absolutely crucial to Damar's life, if it wasn't for the professionalism of the Buffalo Bills trainer and the EMS on scene, who acted under a pressure that almost no other medical professional could ever possibly comprehend. Thanks, guys.